Eastern Nevada's countryside is rugged. Mountain ranges and long stretches of high desert are all you can find in the vast distance between towns. They say not much has changed here in 100 years, but that wasn't always the case. Close to the eastern border of the state, where Highway 50 meets Highway 93, lies the town of Ely, where around the turn of the 20th century, a large copper deposit would change the complexion of the area for decades to come. This is the story of the Nevada Northern.
And so the Nevada Northern Railroad was planned by a man by the name of Mark Requa. He was the son of a mining engineer, so he understood the industry, and maybe more importantly, understood how copper was going to come into play in America's future.
You gotta go back a little more than 100 years now, about 120 years, and there's two inventions everyone wants: the electric light and the telephone. Every electric circuit, 2 copper wires. Every telephone, 2 copper wires. So the demand for copper is huge.
So he looked at the deposit here in eastern Nevada, recognized we needed a way to get that out, and planned a railroad.
A narrow gauge line was already in place between Palisade and Eureka, but the 75-mile distance between Eureka and Ely was not ideal, with 4 mountain ranges in between. Requa decided it made more sense to build a longer 120-mile standard gauge line north from Ely to Cobre, where loads could be interchanged onto the transcontinental line more easily.
And so began construction in 1905 with the Consolidated Copper Company, who would hire the Utah Construction Company to come here to eastern Nevada. They began in 1905 in the worst winter since the Donner Party, had to pull off and come back in early 1906. By March, they're laying track again. They would arrive at Cherry Creek, Nevada, 50 miles north of Ely by July the 4th, and arrive in Ely by September 29th of 1906.
Shortly thereafter, the track to the mine at Ruth was constructed, the smelter in McGill went online, and the mining operation was in full swing by 1910. The mining operation in Ruth was very impressive. Almost 20 miles of track filled the pit, constantly being moved so the rail cars could access the shifting load areas. Massive steam shovels would load the copper-rich material straight into open hoppers. The hoppers were ferried around the pit by small steam engines, often called dinkies. These dinkies would transport the loaded cars to a staging area so the regular power could get them on the main line and up to McGill where the smelter was. Then the refined material would be sent north to the Transcon main line.
Well, the railroad would continue to operate and continue to be part of this massive copper mining operation until eastern Nevada became one of the 4 largest copper producers in the country. And we are so focused on producing copper here for 75 years, from 1908 until 1983.
The population in Ely went from just over 500 in the year 1900 to over 4,000, where it hovered for many decades as the copper mining business boomed. The copper mining operation cycled through corporate configurations over the next 50-some-odd years, eventually becoming the property of the Kennecott Copper Corporation in 1958. The Nevada Northern not only shipped copper, but it was also a common carrier, transporting freight and people in and out of the area as the best possible link to the outside world. The good times continued for another 25 years, but maybe things were a little too good. Kennecott was doing so well that they didn't realize the proverbial end of the line was just around the corner.
AT&T, American Telephone Telegraph Company, greatest and largest telecommunication company in the world at the time, determined in the early 1980s that they would replace their copper telephone lines with fiber optic. Fiber optic is made in a laboratory, and that becomes, in essence, a double whammy for a copper producing area like eastern Nevada. You're pulling down copper wire, recycling that, and replacing it with fiber optic. What that does is it takes the price of copper and further drops that because you're increasing the supply and reducing the demand at the exact same time. In 1979, Chile opens up a mine that has the exact same copper content that we have in eastern Nevada. Chile paid $8 a day in 1979. We can't compete with that. Chile doesn't have an environmental protection agency. We can't compete with that. The Soviet Union was in the process of having some governmental difficulties, and it looked for all the world like they needed cash. And so they took what was several 100,000 tons of copper in Soviet warehouses and said, dump it. Just put it on the world market. We don't care what we have into it. Just dump it. We need the cash.
It was no longer profitable to mine copper. The final layoff of workers took place on June 15th of 1983. This left a lot of people in the area without work. The community negotiated with Kennecott to try to get them to turn the railroad into a tourist attraction, as a way for them to give back to a community that had given them so much over the years. But Kennecott was in the mining business, not the tourist railroad business. This eventually led Kennecott to donate all of its property to the White Pine Historical Railroad Foundation, the foundation that still operates the railroad. This is what brings us to Ely today. The railroad still exists, and it's almost identical to how it was when Kennecott left in 1983.
Here we have 56 acres and over 70 buildings and structures. We have 4 of the original steam locomotives, 8 of the original diesel locomotives, and over 100 pieces of antique rolling stock. We have the original buildings, the original track, and the original paperwork. We have the employee payroll sheets from day one of the railroad all the way up to today. We're not only preserving the tracks, the trains, the locomotives, the paperwork, but what we're doing is telling people about how to dream big. This place is a time capsule. Locomotive 93 was delivered here in January of 1909. Locomotive 40 was delivered here July of 1910. And they're still doing today what their designers and builders intended over 100 years ago. They're still hauling trains.
We begin our modern-day journey here at the Nevada Northern Engine House. Number 40 is being prepared for the day's operations. Strange as it sounds, this locomotive will be running light for the first 2 runs of the day.
One of our real big events is our Be the Engineer program, where you can come and actually operate one of our locomotives with or without cars on a 14-mile round trip.
Our fireman today is Mike Hughes. The locomotive is parked for a few minutes as the train master and guest engineer go to the depot in order to retrieve their track warrant and train order. Moments later, the locomotive is underway, being led out of the yard by train master Angie Stevens. Once the engine clears the yard limits, the guest engineer is allowed to take over. The locomotive emerges from Tunnel 1. This is one of 3 tunnels that were originally constructed through Robinson Canyon to allow trains to go from Ely to Ruth. The guest engineer for this run is Mike Ninneman. The locomotive rounds this broad sweeping curve as it enters an area of the line known as Keystone. From this angle, you can see the track in the foreground that the train will back down in a moment. The switch that the engine just went over is where the trains emerge facing the opposite direction on their way back toward Ely. This aerial view shows the entire Y. Ruth is less than a mile west of this location. The turnouts on this Y are made up of 3 spring switches that reverse after being passed. This allows the train crews to negotiate the entire Y without having to throw any switches. It's standard procedure for the train to pause on the south tail track in Keystone Gulch. This is done so the train crew can check over the locomotive and apply lubrication before heading back to Ely.
We have an intern program where we try to bring in young men and women to work the summer with us to learn heritage railroading and to give us a hand keeping the entire complex working.
We catch up with one of those interns, Nick Shareski, in the engine house.
Started out as a rear brakeman, doing some of that stuff, which is really fun. And then I'll come back here into the shop, and I've been doing everything from cleaning windows, cleaning these inspection pits, to actually helping with mechanical work on the engines or lubing them down or, whatever they'll have me doing.
With all the engineer for a day runs completed, number 40's preparing to take the regular excursion train out to Keystone and back. The train has to back down to the end of the yard to get out on the main line. On a different day, the train comes around the corner on the Ore Line bypass track. The original main line went straight through town. The Ore bypass track was built on the hillside that borders the northern edge of town in order to spare the residents and businesses the disruption of an ore train rumbling through every 30 minutes. What appears to be a foreboding stormy sky in the background is actually smoke pollution that was caused by wildfires burning all over the western United States. The train enters the Y at Keystone. The train stops momentarily on the west leg of the Y in order to reverse direction. The train backs around the corner onto the south leg of the Y. A few minutes later, after being lubricated and checked, the train re-emerges on the east leg of the Y, headed back toward Ely. As it enters Robinson Canyon, the train greets a truck on the highway with a whistle of its own.
Your electricity, unless it's hydro, is produced by boiling water and steam. The heat source can be coal, natural gas, or nuclear, but the principles are exactly the same as locomotive 40 going down the track. You're boiling water to produce steam to produce work. So the relevance of these mechanical skills are just as important today as they were with the founding of the railroad back in 1905. That's really the importance of the preservation of the complex here. It's just not the locomotives, the cars, the track, but it's preserving that can-do-itness. There are so many stories from the history of railroading where, the railroads look like they hit a dead end. And they went, okay, so this isn't working. Let's figure something else out and make this work. And they did. Were they successful every time? No. But, and this is the difference, they picked themselves off, they dusted themselves off, and they tried it again until they found success.
As the train recedes in the distance, it will enter the ore line bypass from here, return to the yard, and consider the day's work done.
About 4 times a year, we operate the Steptoe Valley Flyer. And the Steptoe Valley Flyer is the original passenger cars with the original locomotive. It's locomotive 40, built in 1910. It is a baggage RPO, and RPO is Railway Post Office car, 20, which was built in 1906, and then first class, mind you, coach 5, that was built in 1882. Two-thirds of the seats in 5 are red velvet. One-third of the seats are leather, and there's a partition separating the two sections. The women and children rode with the red velvet seats. The men rode in the leather seats. And in the section with the leather seats are little copper plates about yay by yay, and they're very rough, and they feel like nail files. They're match strikers. And in the men's section, they got match strikers next to the seats so the men could light their cigarettes and cigars. And the women's section doesn't have that. Our winter photo shoots are my favorite time of the year. The cold weather produces huge plumes of steam. And when we do the photo shoots, we try to ditch the modern equipment outside of the yard. And so you can come here and photograph the original equipment on the original track in front of the original buildings. I mean, strip the color out of the photo. When was it taken? Could have been taken any time, depending on where you are on the railroad, from 1909 to current day.
The Steptoe Valley Flyer train set enters the Y. It reemerges a few minutes later after completing its turning process.
New for 2019 is we're going to do a photography workshop. We have Steve Kreis and also Mike Massey will be coming out as instructors for 3.5 days of how to shoot trains and more importantly, how to use your fancy digital camera.
After returning to East Ely, the train backs down the station track. A little while later, number 40 eases past the RIP building with the Steptoe Valley Flyer train set in tow. If you look carefully, you can see a velocipede stored just inside the roll-up door as the number 40 tucks the Steptoe Valley Flyer train set back into the RIP building. The Nevada Northern Railway was recognized as a National Historic Landmark in 2006. It's not every day you get to see a heritage railroad or any historic place in this very complete state of preservation. It's a working railroad that inspires the next generation to rise up and meet challenges with vigor and the can-do attitude of a bygone era. It was built to move copper, but today it moves people in a way you can only understand by taking the time to visit.
If you wanted me to sum up in a nutshell what makes the Nevada Northern Railway so special, that's it. Locomotive 40, blowing her whistle here, rolling through the original yard as she has been since 1910. It just doesn't get any better than that.